Hello there everybody, welcome back to the biology series. This is the second episode in the biology series. We're going to talk about the plasma membrane, which is the phospholipid bilayer. And the first thing I want you to understand is what a phospholipid is. So a phospholipid is a type of fat just like a triglyceride. You can see the triglyceride here. This is the molecule set up of a triglyceride. It has 3 fatty acids on this glycerol backbone here, okay? And this is a phospholipid here. It differs in the way as it has the phosphate where the last or one of the 3 fatty acids were on the triglyceride. 3 fatty acids. Triglyceride is 3 fatty acids, glyceride is glycerol backbone here. And the phospholipid is set up like a triglyceride, only it has the phosphate. Okay, so it's a phosphate lipid. All right. The way it arranges itself is it has this part here at the top, like this. Okay, this part is hydrophilic. Okay, and hydrophilic means it likes water. A triglyceride doesn't have that phosphate in it, so it's hydrophobic, doesn't like water. Okay, so we see when we look at this little bit over here in the corner, you can see this phosphate part here is this part here. It arranges itself into the little head of the phosphate, the phospholipid, and the fatty acids, the 2 fatty acids that are left, have a little tail like that on there. And that arranges itself in the phospholipid bilayer. So this is the phospholipid. This here is the makeup of the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so remember the head is hydrophilic. So it likes water. So that's why it arranges itself like this, because there's water outside of the cell and there's water inside of the cell. Remember from the first video that we did, most of the cell is water. And outside of the cell, we are made up of mostly water. So this is why the membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, is just that, 2 layers of phospholipids. And hydrophilic on the outsides and hydrophobic on the insides, which actually makes it very difficult to pass through. So this here is another diagram of the phospholipid bilayer. A bit more of what you can see here is how they're arranged. Okay, so you've got all your phospholipids there arranged so that the fatty part of it is on the inside, which is more hydrophobic. You can also see other things on there, okay, like this here, and this structure here, and these here on the outside. Okay, we'll talk about those. Those are types of protein in the phospholipid bilayer. So the phospholipid bilayer is made up of mostly lipids and proteins, kind of a 50-50 split between them. All right. The lipids are obviously phospholipids, as we spoke about, and cholesterol. Now cholesterol, I don't know if you can see on this little diagram here, are the little inserts in between each of the phospholipids. They're dotted about all over between the phospholipids in the membrane. Now the phospholipid bilayer as a whole is semi-permeable. It means small things and neutral negative things can go through it, whilst positively charged and large molecules cannot. So I've highlighted that here. Anything large and anything charged cannot go through the phospholipid bilayer. So in order for those large and charged molecules to get through, we need these particular proteins here and here, as you see, all different proteins. And the proteins are made up of glycoproteins. They're integral proteins. These are the ones that stick right through the width of the layer, and they are peripheral proteins. These are the ones here that you can see right on the edge. Okay, and the integral proteins mostly deal with transport. They are channels through the bilayer, whereas the peripheral ones are mostly receptors and for communication. we'll just move on to the fats for a moment. We'll come back to the proteins in a second. But let's just talk a little bit more about the fats because they are super important in the membrane, especially the cholesterol. The cholesterol helps for the flexibility of the membrane and also aids those little particles, those small particles, to pass through. Without cholesterol, the cells would become rigid and less mobile, causing major issues in every type of cell. Remember, we spoke about some types of cells in the first episode, but there are all different kinds of cells. They all need some cholesterol in them, quite a bit actually, to make sure that the cells do not become rigid, to make sure that they are fluid, especially the plasma membrane, which is around the outside of each cell. There are also phospholipid bilayers around every organelle, all the important organelles. There's actually 2 around the nucleus inside the cell. So you can see how cholesterol is quite important. And overall, high cholesterol levels, when measured at a cellular level, is mandatory for human biological health. So we need that cholesterol. So the proteins, let's get to the proteins in the bilayer. They're found as different kinds, integral and peripheral, like we say. These integral ones here. Some of these integral proteins act as channels and some act as pumps, like transport for things that are large and things that are charged. In order to do this, we have to enlist the help of ATP and the protein channel, the protein transport channel. And ATP goes through a process called active transport, which is taking low concentration gradients to high concentration gradients, not the other way around. Remember we said diffusion osmosis goes from high to low, which is passive transport. We're talking about active transport. And what the pump does is it collects 3 molecules of sodium and brings them into the cell, and then throws out another 2 molecules of potassium, therefore helping the concentration of these 2 important ions to equalize from inside to out and vice versa. Like I say, there's other kinds of channels which work with other ions and other kind of molecules. A molecule like glucose. Glucose cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer because it is a large molecule. If you've ever seen the molecule of glucose, it's quite large. So it has to be either broken down into a smaller molecule first. This is why glucose cannot enter the mitochondria. People think that glucose powers your mitochondria. It does not. It cannot enter the mitochondria by itself. Because remember, also, the mitochondria has a phospholipid bilayer, as other organelles do. I also spoke of peripheral proteins. These tend to sit on the outside of the bilayer and work primarily as receptors. They can interact with other cells, other hormones, all kinds of hormones, and other molecules as well. So think of them as bouncers on a club door. They decide whether the molecule coming in contact with it can go through, whether it's safe, whether it's of self, which means is it recognized, is it a bacteria, or is it something that the body actually recognizes? And then they will decide whether or not it is allowed to start to interact with the membrane. Now, peripheral proteins are actually glycoproteins, which is not, as people think, it's not a sugar protein. It's 2 molecules stitched together. It's a carbohydrate molecule and it's a protein molecule. They're 2 separate things. They are just joined together. It's not one big thing. And these glycoproteins help for better protection of the cell, like say receptors. They decide whether or not something's good, and they can also allow for fast and efficient connection with other cells. They interact really, really well. It helps with that. So there's your phospholipid bilayer. There's all the different kind of interactions that happen in a phospholipid bilayer. It is mostly 50-50 between fats and proteins. Your cholesterol is super important to keep the cell moving, to keep it fluid. We do not want rigid phospholipid bilayers, they'd be no good to anybody. And the cholesterol also helps those little molecules sneak through too. Like water, for instance. Water's a small molecule, so it helps water go in and out of cells. If we didn't have cholesterol, that would not happen. Okay, so it's super important. Nothing can go through that is large or charged. That is why we need the proteins. Different proteins, integral, peripheral on the edge, mostly as receptors, and integral to help things pass through the membrane. One being the sodium potassium pump, which brings in 3 sodium, gets rid of 2 potassium by way of active transport to keep the concentration gradient how it should be. As we can see here, I've drawn the concentration gradient off, but when things are low, they will move to high via active transport and vice versa via passive transport, which is easily explained by diffusion and osmosis. So I hope you've enjoyed this little video on the phospholipid bilayer, and stay tuned if you'd like more on organelles, especially the mitochondria, how we get energy and how energy goes through our system. See you for now.